The spilled wine. Jason intentionally spills a drink on Elena and demands she clean it, only for Alexander to catch her hand and tell her, never again. The moment Jason spotted her through the gilded crowd of the Metropolitan Gala, his triumph curdled in his throat. Elena stood near the crystal fountain, a server's tray balanced with trembling precision, wearing a uniform that Jason had spent the last 2 years ensuring was her only skin. She wasn't supposed to be a threat tonight. She was supposed to be the invisible witness to his coronation, the man who had stripped her of her savings and her brilliance now hosting the city's elite. "Darling, why is that girl staring at us?" his new wife murmured, her diamonds catching the light as she clung to Jason's sharp blue sleeve. "Nobody," Jason spat, the word a desperate shield. "Just a ghost who doesn't know when to stay dead." But Elena wasn't looking at Jason's stolen finery. Her eyes were locked on Alexander, the reclusive kingmaker, whose presence at the gala had turned every shark in the room into prey. In the ruthless world of real estate, Alexander's word was law. He built empires with a nod and crushed them with a whisper. Jason watched, paralyzed, as Alexander ignored the dignitaries and the press, moving through the crowd with a singular, lethal focus. Jason's stomach dropped as Alexander stopped directly in front of the server he had just publicly belittled. 3 years ago, Jason had buried Elena's name under forged signatures and a bitter divorce, convinced her algorithms were his to keep. But as Alexander reached out to pull her into a protective public embrace, Jason realized the woman he had tried to break was the only one holding the keys to the empire he was about to lose. 4 years ago, the garage of their suburban rental hadn't smelled of luxury or expensive tobacco. It smelled of stale coffee, soldering iron smoke, and the frantic heat of a server rack that hummed like a living thing. While Jason spent his nights at high-end hotel bars, nursing single malts and networking with mid-level brokers, Elena lived in the blue light of 3 monitors. She was the architect of the silence, weaving lines of code into a real estate algorithm that didn't just track markets. It predicted them with the chilling accuracy of a crystal ball. "It's almost ready, Jason," she had whispered one rainy Tuesday, her eyes bloodshot but glowing with the pride of a creator. She had found the ghost in the machine, the specific logic that turned raw data into a map of future wealth. Jason had leaned over her shoulder, not to look at the beauty of the math, but to check the time. He had a dinner meeting with a group of venture capitalists, and he needed a miracle to sell. "That's great, honey," he'd said, his voice already practiced in the smooth, dismissive tone he would later master. He didn't understand the code, but he understood the greed it could ignite. "Just keep polishing it. I'll handle the big picture stuff. You just worry about the soft stuff, the technicals." The betrayal didn't happen with a roar, it happened with a pen. While Elena slept the heavy, exhausted sleep of a woman who had just birthed an empire, Jason sat at the kitchen table with a stack of patent transfer documents. He had spent weeks practicing her signature, tracing the elegant loops of her name until he could replicate it with a terrifying, hollow precision. With each forged stroke, he systematically erased her from her own life's work. He moved the IP into a shell company he alone controlled, effectively turning the woman who had built his future into a ghost in her own home. When the patents were filed, the name Elena Vance was nowhere to be found. There was only Jason Cole, visionary. He had stolen her mind while she dreamed of their shared success, convinced that as long as he wore the suit and told the story, the world would never care who actually built the foundation. He had built his throne on a lie, never realizing that the truth he buried wasn't dead, it was just waiting for the right light to reveal the cracks in his marble. The damp, narrow hallway behind the ballroom smelled of industrial cleaner and discarded hors d'oeuvres, a stark contrast to the opulence just a few thin walls away. Elena stood in the cramped staff changing room, her fingers tracing the rough polyester of her server's vest. Her reflection in the cracked mirror looked tired, a woman fated by 1,000 small humiliations Jason had engineered to keep her small. A sharp, rhythmic knock startled her. Before she could answer, 2 women in charcoal gray suits, Alexander's personal security, stepped inside with the silent efficiency of high-tier predators. They carried a garment bag of heavy, midnight blue silk and a slim, black leather folio. Without a word, they placed the items on the scarred wooden bench. "Mr. Alexander sends his regards," the taller one said, her voice like polished glass. "He suggests you stop hiding your fire behind a tray." When they left, Elena unzipped the bag. The dress that spilled out was a strike of lightning, a gown of bold, unapologetic red. It wasn't just clothing, it was a statement of war. The fabric was heavy and cool, a shade of crimson that seemed to pulse with its own heat. It was the color of a warning Jason was too arrogant to see coming. Next to the dress lay the folio. Elena opened it, expecting more legal threats or perhaps a bribe to stay silent. Instead, her eyes widened as she scanned the documents. Alexander hadn't just been watching her. He had been dissecting Jason. The pages were a map of a crumbling kingdom. She saw high-interest private loans taken out against her stolen patents, leveraged to the breaking point. She saw the Success Gala was being funded by credit Jason didn't actually have. He was a man standing on a pedestal made of thin ice, and Alexander had just handed her the hammer. The imposter syndrome Jason had spent years cultivating in her mind began to fracture. She wasn't a nobody from his past. She was the architect who held the keys to his total liquidation. Jason had stripped her of her savings, but he couldn't strip the logic from her brain. The same logic Alexander was now betting on. Elena stripped off the gray server's uniform, letting the symbols of her servitude fall to the floor like ash. She stepped into the red silk, the dress clinging to her silhouette like armor. As she fastened the last hidden clasp, she looked in the mirror and didn't see a victim. She saw the woman who was about to walk into a room full of sharks and show them who really owned the water. The heavy oak doors of the Metropolitan Ballroom swung open, and the hum of high society chatter died a sudden, jagged death. Elena didn't walk into the room, she possessed it. The bold red gown moved like liquid fire against the gold-leafed pillars, a vibrant, defiant stroke of color in a sea of safe blacks and muted silvers. Every head turned, but Elena's gaze was a straight line, cutting through the perfume and the pretense toward the center of the floor. Jason stood there, his chest puffed out in his sharp blue suit, a glass of vintage champagne held like a scepter. When he saw her, his smirk didn't just fade, it curdled. He didn't recognize the poised goddess in the red armor as the woman he had ordered to scrub the floors of his ego only an hour ago. Beside him, Alexander stood like a monolith of quiet, terrifying power, his presence the only thing keeping the room from spinning off its axis. "Elena?" Jason's voice was a thin, strangled rasp. He stepped forward, his habitual arrogance surging up to mask his mounting panic. He forced a jagged laugh, turning toward Alexander with his hand outstretched, a desperate attempt to regain control of the narrative. "Mr. Alexander, please excuse this intrusion. My ex-wife has always had a flair for the dramatic, even when she's uninvited." Alexander didn't even blink. He looked at Jason's extended hand as if it were a smudge on a masterpiece, his expression one of bored, clinical disdain. He didn't take the hand. He didn't even acknowledge Jason's existence. Instead, Alexander took a single, deliberate step past him, his focus narrowing entirely onto Elena. The ballroom felt as if it were holding its breath, the air thick with the scent of ozone and impending ruin. Alexander reached out, his hand firmly but gently cupping Elena's face, his thumb grazing her jawline in a gesture of absolute public protection. Elena didn't flinch, she leaned into the touch, her eyes locking onto his with a clarity that signaled the end of her silence. Then Alexander pulled her into a passionate, lingering kiss. It wasn't just a romantic gesture, it was a coronation. Around them, the elite guests gasped, their champagne glasses frozen midair as hundreds of phones rose in a synchronized wave of digital voyeurism. The kingmaker wasn't just choosing a partner, he was declaring a new queen. Jason stood frozen, his hands still hanging in the empty air, his face a contorted mask of humiliated disbelief. The gravity of the room had shifted, leaving him stranded on the wrong side of history. As Alexander finally broke the kiss, he kept his arm possessively around Elena's waist, turning her to face the room. The bully had spent the night trying to break her spirit, but with a single move Alexander had ensured that by midnight, Jason would be the only one left in the wreckage. The silence following the kiss was not peaceful. It was a vacuum, a hollow space where Jason's ego used to reside. Jason stood paralyzed, his eyes darting from Alexander's possessive grip on Elena's waist to the sea of glowing screens that had just broadcast his humiliation to the world. The air in the ballroom grew cold, the golden light of the chandeliers suddenly feeling like a spotlight on a crime scene. "You can't do this," Jason stammered, his voice cracking into a high, pathetic register. He looked around for support, but his new wife had already retreated into the shadows, and his investors were busy checking their portfolios. "She's a nobody. I built this. Every cent, every algorithm, it's mine." Alexander stepped forward, his expression as sharp and clinical as a surgeon's blade. He didn't raise his voice, but the low, resonant hum of his words carried to every corner of the room. "You built a house of cards, Jason, and you built it on land you didn't own. I've spent the last 48 hours doing a final audit of your primary holding company. You are in default on over $80 million of private equity loans. Alexander paused, a ghost of a predatory smile touching his lips. Loans that I purchased in full this morning. The blood drained from Jason's face, leaving him a sickly shade of gray. He squeezed his eyes shut, one hand clutching at his face as if he could physically block out the reality of his ruin. He began to break down, his shoulders heaving with a jagged, ugly sob that the crowd captured in high definition. He reached out a hand toward Elena in a desperate, trembling gesture, but she remained motionless, her silhouette a pillar of unapologetic red silk. You aren't just broke, Jason. You're irrelevant, Alexander continued, his hand resting firmly on Elena's shoulder in a display of dominance and protection. The patents you stole, the algorithms you faked your way through, they've been reclaimed. As the primary debt holder, I am exercising my right to restructure the board. I am handing the keys of this empire back to the person who actually possessed the mind to build it. Alexander turned to the stunned crowd, his voice taking on the finality of a gavel. Meet your new CEO, Elena Vance. Jason collapsed onto the granite floor, a shattered man in a sharp blue suit, his face twisted in a mask of disbelief and agony. He had spent the evening trying to break her spirit, but as the security guards Alexander had bought and paid for stepped forward to escort him out, Jason finally realized the truth. He hadn't just lost his company, he had been erased by the very woman he thought he could bury. Elena didn't look back as he was hauled away. She looked at the room, and for the first time, the room looked back with the respect she had always earned. The doors to the service exit hissed shut behind Jason's muffled pleas, leaving the ballroom in a state of electric, breathless suspension. Elena stood at the center of the granite floor, the red silk of her gown shimmering like a cooling ember under the weight of 1,000 silent stares. She didn't look like a woman who had just survived a war, she looked like a woman who had finally stepped into the light of her own making. Alexander stepped back, yielding the floor with a subtle, respectful inclination of his head. He wasn't the lead anymore. He was the support, the silent titan who had simply cleared the brush so the true architect could stand. Elena reached out and took the microphone from the podium, her grip steady, her eyes scanning the room with a calm, predatory clarity that made even the most seasoned investors shift uncomfortably in their seats. For 3 years, this company has operated under a false name and a stolen vision, Elena began, her voice a low, melodic chime that carried to the very back of the hall. You were told that success was a product of charisma and networking. You were sold a story about a genius who moved markets with a smile. She paused, her gaze landing on the empty space where Jason had stood only moments before. But stories don't write code. Charisma doesn't calculate risk. And a brand built on a lie is nothing more than a debt waiting to be collected. The room remained motionless, the shock of the Iron Kingmaker's endorsement still settling over them like dust. Elena's voice grew stronger, stripped of the hesitation that had once defined her. Tonight the debt is settled. I am not here to be a partner to the past, and I am certainly not here to play a part in someone else's myth. My name is Elena Vance, and I am the author of every line of logic that built this empire. She looked at the sea of glowing phone screens, no longer seeing them as weapons of humiliation, but as the printing presses of her new reality. The merger is cancelled. The board is being purged. Tomorrow we begin the work of building something that doesn't require a mask to survive. Jason spent the evening telling you I was a nobody. I'm here to tell you that he was right, because the woman he thought he knew never existed. I am the future of this industry, and I'm just getting started. As she lowered the microphone, the silence didn't break. It transformed into a synchronized, thunderous applause. Elena didn't smile for the cameras. She simply turned toward Alexander, her head held high, and walked away from the wreckage of her old life. The gala was over, but her reign had just begun.